You will be shocked when you learn why people are buried in the ocean. Today, I will tell you about this amazing tradition, how it started, where it is still practiced, and how humane it is. At the end of the video, I'll also share who nowadays can be honored with such a burial. Enjoy watching. You've probably seen footage of American military personnel burying their comrades at sea. These scenes look extremely dramatic and at the same time fascinating. It immediately raises the question, why don't they bury the deceased on land like everyone else? Why do they send the coffin into the sea? Where did this tradition come from? I'd like to tell you all about it today, but let's start with some history. How long do you think this amazing tradition has been around? It seems it dates back to the times when the first large ships appeared. You'd be right, because sailors are the ones most often given these honors, and there are several reasons for that. But the very first instances of sea burials were known long before the formation of any professional fleets capable of covering vast distances. I'm actually in shock because even in ancient Egypt, despite the common practice of burying the dead in the ground, this tradition already existed. Deceased sailors were buried right in the Nile River or the Mediterranean Sea. And let me remind you that back then there were no massive cruisers that could stay away from the shore for months. So why did the ancient Egyptians use this method? It's most likely related to their deep religiosity. Egyptians worshipped many gods, including the god of water. Therefore, this burial method was considered proper, as it allowed the sailor's soul to easily reach the afterlife. The Phoenicians, another ancient people known as skilled sailors, spent almost their entire lives on the water. However, even in their traditions, sea burials were rare. Most often, such cases occurred out of necessity when it was impossible to reach land quickly. But after several hundred years, people finally learned to build really high-quality and long-distance ships. Take the Vikings, for example. These Scandinavian warriors were known as some of the best sailors. They had a very interesting tradition. If a comrade died, they would send him on a ship voyage and set it on fire at the same time. If you've watched the series of animated films How to Train Your Dragon, you've probably seen this process in one of the episodes. It looks incredibly spectacular.
And I've decided that I want to die.
However, even here, it wasn't always possible to give such honors to the deceased. There were many cases where, far from their homeland, the Vikings had to simply throw bodies overboard. Not very religious or humane, right? I'd also like to tell you more about the religious aspect of this fascinating ritual. For instance, in ancient Greece and Rome, people were mainly buried on land. But there were exceptions. For example, if someone died during a sea expedition, religion plays an important role here. These ancient peoples believed in various myths. One of them was the story of Charon, a sacred spirit or even a god who ferried souls across the river Styx. So, if the deceased was honored with a sea burial, this method helped him cross the river and achieve his goals. But what about the times when much more powerful and durable ships appeared, allowing people to travel around the world? During those times, the tradition became much more popular. Why? Well, imagine you're on a small ship with several dozen or even hundreds of people. Suddenly, for some reason, one of your comrades dies on board. What do you do with him? If you leave the body on the deck, it will soon start to smell unpleasant. Moreover, various bacteria will develop inside the corpse, which isn't very good for living organisms, not to mention that he might have died from something contagious, putting the entire crew at risk. That's why people in the Middle Ages tried to bury the dead. Even though back then there was no understanding of microorganisms, viruses, and so on, everyone thought about the foul miasmas. So what would you do as a captain if it would take several weeks to reach land, your sailor died of an unknown disease, and refrigeration was out of the question in those distant times? Of course, you'd throw the body overboard. But back then, this method of burial was considered much more humane and even desirable. After all, for a true sailor, the ocean is his second home. Here, I anticipate some sharp comments regarding these situations. How can you just throw a body overboard? What about the relatives and loved ones? They would be worried. They wouldn't even be able to say goodbye. Friends, I completely agree with you. However, ancient people had absolutely no choice. It was either this or risk the lives of the entire crew. Modern cruise liners have fully equipped morgues, but in those times all sailors had were holds full of provisions and cramped cabins. You might also say that throwing bodies overboard kills all ocean life. Friends, have you ever thought about what happens to marine animals that die in the water? We're not just talking about small fish. Take whales, sharks, and dolphins, for example. These are huge creatures, often much larger than a human. They can also get sick, injured, and die right in the water. They can even suffocate there. Do you think fish hold underwater funerals like in SpongeBob? Not at all. On our wonderful planet Earth, there's a thing called the cycle of matter in nature. Any organism that dies eventually disappears. And in the ocean or sea, this happens much faster. Moreover, you sometimes won't even find the bones of the deceased because something will eat them too. Take a whale, for instance. A massive carcass weighing as much as a truck, filled with billions of microorganisms and highly nutritious for all living things. It's a real smorgasbord for anyone interested. Within a few hours of death, several predatory fish will gather around the carcass, ruthlessly tearing it apart. And do you know what happens after a day?
What is he doing?
He's beginning to believe.
The ocean floor will be teeming with various life forms. Sharks, hagfish, crabs, octopuses, and regular fish. It will be packed. You'll be shocked, but in just a few weeks, almost nothing will be left of the carcass. Of course, the bones will take a long time to decompose, but there are microorganisms in the water that will eat even those. It will take them only about 50 years. Now let's return to human burials. With this short lecture on marine life, I wanted to show that death is just a part of life. So you could say that this method of burial is most beneficial for our planet. In this way, thousands, even millions of organisms can continue to exist. What happens if the burial is on land? In that case, the feast is only for microorganisms and especially persistent worms, and the bones will never disappear. So think about what is more beneficial and humane. Now let's return to the tradition itself. Since we've already discussed the reasons for this burial method, it's time to learn about the details. Let's start with preparing the body. First, as in all cases of death nowadays, it's important to conduct a forensic examination to determine the cause of death. Although this practice can be skipped if the death occurred for obvious reasons. After this, the body is wrapped in a shroud. If you didn't know, this is a special garment or cloth, usually white. It's always used to cover the bodies of deceased people before placing them in a coffin. Now comes the specifics of sea burial. If in a normal case the body is simply placed in a coffin, here you have to get creative.
What?
The fact is, a human body is light enough to float. Yes, indeed, a person shouldn't sink. You might say this is nonsense, considering how many drownings there are. No one will argue with you here. But don't think that death in these cases is caused by water itself. It's caused by asphyxiation, due to lack of air, and the bodies of the deceased float quite well if there are no weights on them. In fact, to avoid sinking, you just need to lie on your back, take in as much air as possible, and stay still. Panic will only hinder you in such a situation. For this reason, when preparing a body for sea burial, a heavy object is tied to it to make it sink faster. Firstly, this allows the body to decompose as quickly as possible. Secondly, it won't bother passing sailors. Sometimes no weights are used at all. Nowadays, most burials are conducted using a coffin. As you can imagine, it's quite easy to place a heavy object or even bags of sand in the coffin. But there's a catch. These coffins need to decompose easily in water to avoid negatively impacting marine flora and fauna. Therefore, plain white odd is used, rarely treated. Paint and oils can preserve the wood for a long time, which isn't needed for sea burials. Then, the coffin with the body is simply lowered into the water.
What?
An important fact, this is usually done head first, and if the body sinks quickly, it's a good sign. It symbolizes that the person has returned to nature and the ocean. This is how typical sea burials are conducted. On this note, I'd like to make a brief digression. The fact is, Nowadays, almost everything has some sort of legal or regulatory aspect. Even a person's death and the actions taken with their body are strictly outlined in numerous papers, documents, and so on. For the relatives of the deceased, dealing with the bureaucratic hassle often becomes as challenging as the grief itself. Therefore, I'd like to highlight the legality of such burial methods. In general, sea burials are a strictly regulated tradition.
How?
Many international and national laws might obstruct you if you wish to conduct such a burial. Why? Well, for example, there are special principles and requirements aimed at minimizing the environmental impact on the marine environment. What are these requirements? First, you need to obtain a special permit to conduct the burial, and it's not granted to everyone. Some deceased individuals may pose a threat to the marine environment, for instance, if they were heavily contaminated by radiation. You've probably heard stories about the burial of firefighters who extinguished the fourth reactor at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Sealed metal coffins buried in remote areas because they were literally dangerous to everyone around. The same applies at sea. It's also important to consider the burial location. For example, lakes, reservoirs, and other freshwater bodies are not suitable. Coastal zones are out of the question. In short, to conduct a sea burial, you need to sail very far from the shore. The depth at the burial site should be at least 4,000 feet. Tough requirements, aren't they? Despite all these restrictions, such traditional burials are quite common today. However, they mostly occur in places like America, Canada, or England. For some reason, I personally haven't heard much about naval personnel from other countries being buried at sea, although I don't rule out the possibility that military personnel in countries like Russia, Kazakhstan, or even China might receive such honors. In what cases is this method of burial chosen? Nowadays, almost every large vessel has special freezer compartments, or even a full morgue. The process is straightforward.
Let's go.
If a person wrote a complete will during their lifetime specifying their desired burial method, efforts will be made to fulfill their last wish. So, if you want to be buried this way, it's quite possible. You'll just need some time, prepared documents, and relatives ready to carry out your last wish. Alternatively, if you were born in India, you might be entitled to a burial in the Ganges River. However, once you learn about this custom, you might not desire such an honor. But that's a topic for another time. What do you think? Is the tradition of burying the deceased at sea or in the ocean humane or not? Share your thoughts in the comments. Personally, I'd like to highlight the opinions of experts who believe that such burial methods are far more beneficial for our world than traditional ones.
Bro, what are you talking about, man?
By the way, speaking of experts, do you know where real professionals are needed? In our team. Friends, you have the opportunity to join our team. If you have skills in video editing, can voice over videos in Russian, English, or other languages, or write interesting scripts, we'd love to work with you. Contact us via the Telegram bot. The link is in the description. Thank you for your attention.